Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today, we've got another round of questions submitted by viewers like you. Remember, if you have a question about the ship and would like to see it answered in this format, drop it in the comments down below. We'll get to it as soon as we can. Most of our questions today revolve around the ship's guns. Our first question has to do with the number of shells that the ship carried, what types they were, and then how that number changed over time. So I'm specifically going to talk about the 16-inch shells. If you have questions about the 5-inch shells, which is a completely different number, drop it down below and I'll answer that in a future video. But for the 16-inch shells, they came in two main types. There was the high capacity round, like this one next to me, and then there was the armor piercing round. The armor piercing round stayed pretty generic throughout the ship's career. The high capacity round was modified into a number of different marks and models that could have been used for various things. And each one of these projectiles also had a dummy round associated with it for training purposes. So, total loadout, an Iowa-class battleship could carry 1,220 shells. Turret 1 could hold 390 shells. Turret 2 could hold 460 shells. This turret is one story taller, so it has an extra mezzanine shell deck in addition to the two shell decks that she normally has. And turret 3 could hold 370 shells. 9 shells in each turret, 27 shells total, were practice rounds, so they would be painted blue and they were blind loaded and plugged. Instead of having explosives inside, they had sand. So as designed, battleships were supposed to carry about 15% high capacity shells. These are for firing at unarmored targets or doing shore bombardment, and 85% armor piercing shells. Battleships are designed to fight enemy battleships. So with that in mind, they carried primarily AP shells. So you would have about 180 of your high-capacity shells, and you'd have just over 1,000 armor-piercing shells, plus 27 dummy rounds for training. Theoretically, Iowa-class battleships have a rate of fire of 1 round every 30 seconds. American battleships did achieve rates of fire this high. For example, at the Battle of Sargasso Strait, West Virginia got a rate of fire of about 1 round every 40 seconds for her 16 salvos. However, that was at extremely close range. Normally, if we were firing at full range, it could take over a minute for our projectiles to reach the target. So even though we could theoretically load the gun that fast, often there was a minute or more in between shots, especially when we were doing shore bombardment. So, with 1,200 shells, we could fire for a very long time. It's not the short time that you would think when you see a 30-second reload time. Also, ships tend to block each other's line of fire, so in an engagement there would be downtime. It wouldn't just be continuously firing. Now, interestingly, Iowa-class battleships with about 135 rounds per gun carried way more than possibly any other class of battleship. Most battleships carried about 100 rounds, give or take 20. So the Iowas had a much higher capacity. Did they always carry full capacity? No. In non-wartime situations, almost never. Whenever you would go into and out of a port, you'd have to offload ammunition, unless it was specific ports or specific circumstances, and that could take up to 2 days. So often full loadouts weren't carried. One interesting shell type that was added was the quote-unquote Project Katy shell, which was a nuclear projectile which was developed in the 1950s. And theoretically, Iowa New Jersey, and Wisconsin were all modified to carry these projectiles. And the projectiles were very similar to the high-capacity round. In theory, a special segment of the magazine was set aside for these rounds that would be locked up, and you could assemble the warhead and put in a shell before it was passed up to the guns. And these ships could carry 10 rounds each, plus 9 training rounds, which I assume is in addition to the 9 training rounds that are already in the turret. The Navy has never confirmed whether or not these ships had that modification, or had those shells. We believe that the ships had the modification. Interestingly, Missouri was already decommissioned, so she did not get this modification. 50 shells total were made, so that's enough for each of the Iowas, plus an extra 10 spare in the inventory, which tracks. And in 1960, these shells were removed from service. All of the Iowas had been decommissioned by 1958, so there were no guns that were firing these shells left at that point. Our next question is about ship identification. Specifically, the Japanese had difficulty identifying American ships during World War II. So, for example, during the Battle of Coral Sea, they mistook the oiler Neosho and the destroyer Sims as a aircraft carrier and a cruiser. Famously attacked those ships, completely blew them out of the water for no real tactical value. And this happens on a number of other occasions. So first off, it's not just a Japanese thing. The Japanese had some of the most highly trained aviators in the world at this point. They were combat experienced. They had been running rampant in the Pacific for 6 months, and they were still having issues identifying ships in broad daylight in fairly good weather. And this also is a problem for other navies. Like I said, the Royal Navy famously attacked one of their own cruisers and an American Coast Guard cutter when they were looking for the German battleship Bismarck with their Swordfish torpedo planes that are flying very low and very slow and have now had 2 years of wartime experience. We see it happen all the time, even from ships. Off Samar, the Japanese ship spotters looked at the American destroyers and assumed that they were firing at cruisers, and they looked at the light carriers and assumed they were firing at fleet carriers. So this comes down to a couple of things. One, these nations were intentionally building their ships similarly. So famously, ships like the German Admiral Hipper-class heavy cruisers look very similar to the larger Bismarck-class battleships. And that was an intentional design. Other things were less intentional, but the national flavor of different navies contributed to it. So American destroyer superstructures look very similar to American cruiser superstructures, and so on and so forth. It's so difficult that pilots couldn't even recognize their own ships half the time. And so you have the big meatballs painted on Japanese carrier flight decks. In pre-war years, the American carriers all had their names written on their flight decks. Enterprise had EN written on it. Yorktown had YKTN. Saratoga had a big stripe on her funnel. Yorktown had a big Y painted on the side of her funnel so her pilots could find their way home. And during the war, these were mostly replaced with the carrier hull numbers that were completely blanked over. German ships had huge swastikas painted on their decks. Italian ships had big red and white stripes painted on their decks so that their own pilots didn't attack them. It all comes down to it's really hard to identify an enemy ship from thousands of feet in the air when you're being shot at, ducking into and out of cloud cover in adverse conditions. It's even hard to identify your own ships under those circumstances. Now, there are identification books that lookouts and pilots and those sorts of people would be encouraged to study. You see their silhouettes plotted all over flight ready rooms and things like that. There were even playing cards, and we sell those in our gift shop here, replicas of the playing cards that they would have used that had the ship silhouettes on them. But the silhouettes weren't always entirely accurate. It's intelligence. You're trying to collect information on an enemy fleet that you're fighting. You don't actually know how big their ships are, what size they are. You're more or less guessing and then trying to artistically recreate that. And it's difficult because all the carriers, whether they're a 400-foot-long Jeep carrier or a full 900-foot-long fleet carrier, all have flat decks, an island on the right-hand side, with a few exceptions. Like they all look very similar. All of the fast battleships have tall superstructures. They mostly have two funnels. They mostly have two forward turrets and an aft turret. They're curved bows. It's very, very easy to get confused. I've spent my life learning from books like this what the different ships look like and how it changed from month to month. I'm not in a combat zone being shot at, wondering when we're going to stand down from general quarters so I can get my next meal. I'm also not an 18-year-old kid fresh out of the Great Depression working on my family farm and being thrown into the war. I've spent 20, 25 years doing this. And I guess a lot of you guys who would ask that question are also like that. Our next question is, what parts were stripped from other museum ships to reactivate the Iowas in the 1980s? So this is one of those things that's pretty widely known, that when the Navy was reactivating the Iowas in the 80s, they were stripping parts off of other museum ships, older ships that had been donated. So primarily the other battleships. 4 battleships from World War II, Texas, North Carolina, Massachusetts, and Alabama were all preserved in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s as museum ships. And they've been open and operating ever since then. So in the 1980s, when these ships, which had not been in service since 1969 or earlier, depending on the ship, were being reactivated, the spare parts for their systems were no longer in the naval system. A lot of the spare parts they needed are pretty generic, light fixtures and gauges and things like that. Those are still in the naval system. If we don't want to spend the money to buy them new, there are a ton of ships in the reserve basins that we could strip parts off of. That wasn't an issue. The main issue were things like these: fire control equipment specific to the 16-inch guns, and the older 5-inch 38 caliber guns, and spare parts for those systems themselves, the guns, the turrets, the fire control directors. Those were all things that were no longer being used. I do not have a parts list for stuff used on this ship. If I had to guess, they probably stripped Missouri and Wisconsin to find the parts for New Jersey and Iowa when they were reactivated first. And then in 86, when they started reactivating Missouri and then Wisconsin, they probably then had to go to the other ships. And also when they wanted to keep spare parts in the inventory. So I don't have an exact answer for you, but I'm pretty sure it's stuff like these Mark 8 fire control computer parts that just aren't in the inventory anymore. And probably a lot of the parts stripped were not then immediately put onto the reactivated ships. The parts were stripped and then they were put into the inventory so they could be drawn from by these ships as needed. And they may have never been used at all. Was it just the reactivation of Iowa-class battleships that caused parts to be stripped from earlier museum ships? No. When the aircraft carrier Kitty Hawk was being built, they stripped a lot of watertight doors off of the battleship Massachusetts just to save money. So other ships were doing that at the time. You have to remember the concept of a museum ship was fairly new at that point. does not still do that today. There is no threat today of active duty sailors coming onto one of these ships and stripping parts off. This was a concern, though, 40 years ago. That said, they're building a new submarine named New Jersey. Her crew has come out to this ship to see their legacy vessel, and we have given them steel and teak from this vessel to incorporate into the new vessel, so it carries that tradition forward. As far as actually stripping working parts off of this to reuse, even though a lot of stuff on this ship is still in the Navy inventory, that is not a concern. Have museum ships ever gotten parts from active ships? Yes, absolutely. Periodically, the ships in the reserve fleet are opened up to museum ships to come and strip parts off of. Periodically, museum ships make contacts with active duty sailors and ask them to acquire parts for us. Also, in 1986, when Missouri was being reactivated, while spare parts are being taken from the older battleships, things that were being removed from Missouri, which had been decommissioned since 1956, virtually still in her Korean War configuration, were taken off to be placed on older museum ships. For example, the battleship Texas was turned into a museum without any 40mm guns. When she was decommissioned, those guns were still in the inventory, so they were taken to be used on other vessels. Well, when Missouri was being reactivated in 86, she still had her 40mm guns on board from World War II. And when they took them off to replace them with missiles, they were able to give them to Texas to help with her restoration. So it does go both ways. We've also received a number of questions from people about Battleship Texas and her restoration work, the ongoing work. As many of you know, she was closed down for major hull work with a dry dock pending in the next year, assuming the world doesn't end before that. And they are continuing to work on that project. So I would definitely recommend checking out the Battleship Texas's page. They have a number of employees there who are good friends of mine, have worked in the museums for a while, who are taking good care of her. We've got a link to their page where they post content about every month or so about where they are in the process, in addition to pictures and things of steps. So you're seeing flashing on the screen now some pictures of them removing Missouri's 40mm guns from Texas, preparatory to taking her into dry dock. This is going to allow them to go into dry dock with less weight, less strain on the deck. It's going to allow those guns to get work off of the ship while they're in dry dock. And it's going to allow the bases of those guns, which normally can't get any restoration work done on or around them, to get some maintenance work. Also, the Battleship Wisconsin down in Nauticus had some spare parts, particularly fire control equipment like what you see here, that they had either stripped from other ships or had been donated to them, and they were able to give that to the Battleship Massachusetts to make up for some of the parts which were taken in the 1980s. Our next question is, how often do we have to replace the barrels on the 16-inch guns? For those of you who don't know, our 16-inch guns are rifled, and as we fire shells, that wears down the rifling on the inside of the gun. So theoretically, at a certain point, that rifling becomes smooth and our shells become inaccurate. This is a huge problem when we're shooting projectiles over the horizon, more than 20 miles away. The short answer to this question is every 300 rounds. To go into more detail there, it takes 300 full charges with full weight shells to wear down the rifling. That means that in training, so that they're not wearing down the rifling, they often use reduced service charges so that they can
do training shots, go through the motion, still put a projectile out there, but it's only wearing away a little bit of rifling. So there's some calculation that goes into it that you can fire X number of shells in training before they equal an actual combat shot. Also, the Navy isn't going to wait until their battleship is fired 300 shots to replace the barrels, because you never know when the ship's going to be needed in combat. These ships tend to be rushed from combat zone to combat zone on very short notice. So really, once your ship is fired about 2/3 of the life of its barrels, then you'd want to replace them. So these ships would carry about 100 to 130 rounds per barrel on board. So in a single engagement, we could only ever do 1/3 of what our barrel's life was. Fortunately, several classes of ships that were supposed to be armed with the 16-inch 50 caliber gun were never built. However, these guns have such a long lead time on them that orders for the guns are placed long before orders for the ships are placed. So the Navy has a number of 16-inch 50 caliber guns in their inventory. This meant that in the late 50s, when the battleships following World War II and Korea had fired a reasonable number of shells out of their guns and were going through major yard periods, the Navy decided to replace their barrels already on board with other barrels in the inventory. This was the only time that all the barrels on the ship were replaced. Battleship New Jersey has fired her guns more than any other battleship ever built. So the fact that we only had to replace our guns one time says something about how frequently that happens. Battleship New Jersey is very fortunate in that many of our guns... Battleship New Jersey is very fortunate in that all of our guns that were replaced in the 1950s were retained in the inventory in case they were ever needed again. Since the Navy no longer has 16-inch armed ships, the Army no longer uses 16-inch guns for coastal defense, they're starting to remove these guns from the national inventory. So Battleship New Jersey was able to research where the barrels were. Each one has a 3-digit serial number, and we were able to track them all down. Check out the description down below to see where they all are. In particular, a couple of years ago, 3 of our 16-inch gun barrels were in danger of being cut up for scrap. And we were able to go down and recover them. And this is the left gun barrel from turret number 1 that we carried in World War II and the Korean War. Our next question is about the Japanese surrender. Why wasn't New Jersey chosen? Our commenter has heard the sailor lore, I'll call it, that New Jersey was going to be chosen and wasn't. We all know the story that Missouri was chosen as the site of the surrender because President Truman's daughter had christened her. It was named for his home state. The crew of New Jersey, many of them who we have on interview, believed that they were going to be the site of the Japanese surrender. They were just getting out of the shipyard, so they had just been freshly painted. They were in tremendous material condition, as opposed to the other ships in the fleet, which have been off of Okinawa for 3 months, and there's not much time to do maintenance when you're constantly being attacked by kamikazes. So the crew of this ship thought that they were going to be chosen. They were also the only ship that was both Spruance and Halsey's flagship, the 2 main admirals in the Central Pacific Drive. In the end, Halsey transfers his flag to Missouri and uses her as the flagship. And New Jersey is, instead of being sent to Tokyo Bay, is sent with Admiral Spruance to the Philippines to get ready for the occupation. I think that's pretty unfair, not only to the crew of this ship, but especially to Spruance, who was fighting this war from day one, to be kicked out of the surrender ceremonies and sent to the Philippines. But New Jersey could have been in Tokyo Bay if she was selected. She could have been selected. The crew certainly believed that they were going to be selected. But I've seen no official documentation or anything that said we're going to select this ship and then Truman overwriting it. So it is what I would call sailor lore. So ultimately, a large portion of the fleet was not in Tokyo Bay because we weren't sure it wasn't a trap. In fact, Mizora was training her guns on the Japanese destroyer that was bringing the Japanese delegation out for the surrender. Everybody was on edge, and the bulk of the fleet was not there in Tokyo Bay. Some light expendable ships and some of the big armored ships, but not the whole fleet. Thanks for watching. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for future content. And check the description down below for ways that you can help support this project.